Peace, everybody. It's Mumtahana with Beyond Clouds, and I wanted to take a little bit to talk to y'all about this month's book of the month with Beyond Clouds, and it is this. I hope you can see it past the sun's bright rays. The title is The Other Slavery, the uncovered story of Indian enslavement in America. I started this book last night finally because I've actually had it maybe a couple of years now, and I actually gifted two Clouds with a hard cover copy, and I just hadn't gotten around to reading it. But since last month's book was the 1619 Project, and Beyond Clouds essentially is an Afro-Native Muslim organization. I try to put all that stuff, into it, be inclusive. And so I figured this would be a suitable follow-up to the 1619 Project. So I started it last night, and I have to tell you, it is good, okay? It's really good. I think it's really good. I am a history buff first and foremost, and I just love reading about topics that have something to do with me and mine personally. And of course, this absolutely does. Is very very informative. Many concepts I had never heard of or thought about. Documents and historical events that I knew nothing about, and some that I of course did know about but didn't know to this extent. So in order to encourage some of you to go on ahead and purchase this book, or borrow it from your library, or even get it on Audible, or Libby, or one of those streaming sites, or Scribd. I love Scribd. I didn't even check to see if it was on there before I used the credit on Audible. I don't know. But nonetheless, I want to encourage you all, inspire you all to start this book also. Let me open the window before I pass out. So I'm going to read just the introduction. It's about 10 and a half pages. I'll try not to take too long, but hopefully the introduction itself will do what it is I'm trying to do here. Help you all come to grips and with the fact that you should read this book. So, introduction. The very word slavery brings to mind African bodies stuffed in the hold of a ship, or white aproned maids bustling in an antebellum home. Textbooks, memoirs, and movies continuously reinforce the notion that slaves were black Africans imported into the New World. We may be aware that in the long sweep of history, peoples other than Africans have been held in bondage, a practice that continues today as millions of Asians, hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans, and thousands of Europeans can readily attest. But we still seem unable to escape our historical myopia. Consider the debate at the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. The United States had acquired Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, more than half of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming and Kansas. The question facing the country was whether slavery should be allowed in this vast territorial haul. By slavery, of course, politicians of that era meant African slavery. But the adjective was wholly unnecessary, as everyone in the United States knew who the slaves were. Therefore, it came as a revelation to many Easterners making their way across the continent that there were also Indian slaves, entrapped in a distinct brand of bondage that was even older in the New World, perpetrated by colonial Spain and inherited by Mexico. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the war, this other slavery became a part of America's existence. California may have entered the Union as a free soil state, but American settlers soon discovered that the buying and selling of Indians was a common practice there. As early as 1846, the first American commander of San Francisco acknowledged that certain persons have been and still are imprisoning and holding to service Indians against their will, and warned the general public that the Indian population must not be regarded in the light of slaves. His pleas went unheeded. The first California legislature passed the Indian Act of 1850, which authorized the arrest of vagrant, quote, natives who could then be hired out to the highest bidder. This act also enabled white persons to go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children for indenture. According to one scholarly estimate, this act may have affected as many as 20,000 California Indians, including 4,000 children kidnapped from their parents and employed primarily as domestic servants and farm laborers. Americans learned about this other slavery one state at a time. In New Mexico, James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent of the territory, could not hide his amazement at the sophistication of the Indian slave market. The value of the captives depends upon age, sex, beauty, and usefulness, wrote Calhoun. Good-looking females, not having passed the sear and yellow leaf, are valued from $50 to $150 each. Males, as they may be useful, one half less, never more. Calhoun met many of these slaves and wrote pithy notes about them. Refugio Picaros, about 12 years of age, taken from a rancho near Santiago, state of Durango, Mexico, 2 years ago by Comanches, who immediately sold him to the Apaches. And with them he lived and roamed until January last, 1850, when he was bought by Jose Francisco Lucero, a New Mexican residing at the Morro. Teodoro Martel, 10 or 12 years of age, was taken from the service of Jose Alvarado near Saltillo, Mexico by Apaches 2 years ago, and has remained the greater portion of the time on the west side of the Rio del Norte. Americans settling the West did more than become familiar with this other type of bondage. They became part of the system. Mormon settlers arrived in Utah in the 1840s looking for a promised land, only to discover that Indians and Mexicans had already turned the Great Basin into a slaving ground. The area was like a gigantic moonscape of bleached sand, salt flats, and mountain ranges inhabited by small bands no larger than extended families. Early travelers to the West did not hide their contempt for these digger Indians, who lacked both horses and weapons. These vulnerable peyotes, as they were known, had become easy prey for other mounted Indians. Brigham Young and his followers, after establishing themselves in the area, became the most obvious outlet for these captives. Hesitant at first, the Mormons required some encouragement from slavers, who tortured children with knives or hot irons to call attention to their trade and elicit sympathy from potential buyers, or threatened to kill any child who went unpurchased. Brigham Young's son-in-law, Charles Decker, witnessed the execution of an Indian girl before he agreed to exchange his gun for another captive. In the end, the Mormons became buyers and even found a way to rationalize their participation in this human market. Buy up the Lamanite, which were Indians, children. Brigham Young counseled his brethren in the town of Parowan and educate them and teach them the gospel, so that many generations would not pass ere they should become a white and delightsome people. This was the same logic Spanish conquistadores had used in the 16th century to justify the acquisition of Indian slaves. The beginnings of this other slavery are lost in the mists of time. Native peoples such as the Zapotecs, sorry, I didn't say I was a great reader. Native peoples such as the Zapotecs, Mayas, and Aztecs took captives to use as sacrificial victims. The Iroquois waged campaigns called mourning wars on neighboring groups to avenge and replace their dead. And Indians in the Pacific Northwest included male and female slaves as part of the goods sent by the groom to his bride's family to finalize marriages among the elites. Native Americans had enslaved each other for millennia, but with the arrival of Europeans, practices of captivity originally embedded in the specific cultural context became commodified, expanded in unexpected ways, and came to resemble the kinds of human trafficking that are recognized to us today. The earliest European explorers began this process by taking indigenous slaves. Columbus's very first business venture in the New World consisted of sending 4 caravels loaded to capacity with 550 natives back to Europe to be auctioned off in the markets of the Mediterranean. Others followed in an admiral's lead. The English, French, Dutch, and Portuguese all became important participants in the Indian slave trade. Spain, however, by virtue of the large and densely populated colonies it ruled, became the dominant slaving power. Indeed, Spain was to Indian slavery what Portugal and later England were to African slavery. Ironically, Spain was the first imperial power to formally discuss and recognize the humanity of Indians. In the early 1500s, the Spanish monarchs prohibited Indian slavery except in special cases, and after 1542, they banned the practice altogether. Unlike African slavery, which remains legal and firmly sustained by racial prejudice and the struggle against Islam, the enslavement of Native Americans were against the law. Yet this categorical prohibition did not stop generations of determined conquistadors and colonists from taking native slaves on a planetary scale, from the eastern seaboard of the United States to the tip of South America, and from the Canary Islands to the Philippines. The fact that this other slavery had to be carried out clandestinely made it even more insidious. It is a tale of good intentions gone badly astray. When I began researching this book, one number was of particular interest to me. How many Indian slaves have there been in the Americas since the time of Columbus? My initial belief was that the Indian slavery had been somewhat marginal. Even if the traffic of Indians had flourished during the early colonial period, it must have gone into deep decline once African slaves and paid workers became available in sufficient numbers. Along with most other historians, I assumed that the real story of exploitation in the New World involved the 12 million Africans carried off across the Atlantic. But as I kept collecting sources on Indian slavery in Spanish, Mexican, and U.S. archives, I began to see things differently. Indian slavery never went away, but rather coexisted with the African slavery from the 16th all the way through the late 19th century. This realization made me ponder more seriously the question of visibility. Because African slavery was legal, its victims are easy to spot in the historical record. They were taxed on their entry into ports and appear on bills of sale, wills, and other documents. Because these slaves had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, they were scrupulously, one could even say obsessively, counted along the way. The final tally of 12.5 million enslaved Africans matters greatly because it has shaped our perception of African slavery in fundamental ways. Whenever we read about a slave market in Virginia, a slave engraved into the interior of Angola, or a community of runaways in Brazil, we are well aware that all these events were part of a vast system spanning the Atlantic world and involving millions of victims. Indian slavery is different. Until quite recently, we did not have even a ballpark estimate of the number of natives held in bondage. Since Indian slavery was largely illegal, its victims toiled, quite literally, in dark corners and behind locked doors, giving us the impression that they were fewer than they actually were. Because Indian slaves did not have to cross an ocean, no ship manifests or port records exist, but only vague references to slaving raids. Yet, in spite of the clandestine and invisible nature of Indian slavery and the impossibility of counting Indian slaves accurately, we possess a sizable and continuous paper trail. Historians working on all regions of the New World have found traces of the traffic of Indian slaves in judicial proceedings, official inquiries, and casual mentions of raids in Indian captives in letters and assorted documents. Considered in isolation, a couple of hundred Indians here and there do not seem to amount to much. But once we contemplate the breathtaking geographic scope of this traffic and consider its full chronological sweep, the numbers are astounding. If we were to add up all the Indian slaves taken in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, the figure will run somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million slaves. Such large numbers of enslaved Indians not only approximate the African tragedy in sheer scale, but also reveal an even more catastrophic result in relative terms. Without question, both Africans and Indians lost incommensurably. Yet broad comparisons between the two slaveries, still incipient and subject to revision, can provide some useful context. At the height of the transatlantic slave trade, West Africa suffered a population decline of about 20%, as it went from about 25 million in 1700 to roughly 20 million by 1812. During this time, some 6 million Africans were shipped to the New World, and at least 2 million died in raids and wars related to the traffic of slaves. In absolute numbers, this human loss was tremendous. But in relative terms, indigenous peoples of the New World experienced an even more catastrophic decline in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the Caribbean basin, along the Gulf Coast, and across large regions of northern Mexico and American Southwest, native populations were reduced by 70, 80, or even 90% through a combination of warfare, famine, epidemics, and slavery. Biology gets much of the blame for this collapse, but as we shall see, it is impossible to disentangle the effects of slavery and epidemics. In fact, a synergistic relationship existed between the two. Slaving raids spread germs and caused deaths. Deceased slaves needed to be replaced, and thus their deaths spurred additional raids. I have to remember to have water nearby. Beyond the question of numbers, I became intrigued by some of the unique features of Indian enslavement. For instance, in stark contrast to the African slave trade, which consisted primarily of adult males, the majority of Indian slaves were actually women and children. In this way, the two slaveries seem like mirror images. Indian slave prices from such diverse regions as southern Chile, North Mexico, and the Caribbean reveal a premium paid for women and children over adult males. As noted by the New Mexico Indian agent James Calhoun, Indian women could be worth up to 50 or 60% more than males. What explains this significant and persistent price premium? Sexual exploitation and women's reproductive capabilities are part of the answer. In this regard, Indian slavery constitutes an obvious antecedent to the sex traffic that occurs today. But there were other reasons too. In nomadic Indian societies, men specialized in activities less useful to European colonists, such as hunting and fishing, than women, whose traditional roles included weaving, food gathering, and child-rearing. Some early sources also indicate that women were considered better suited to domestic service, as they were thought to be less threatening in the home environment. And just as masters wanted docile women, they also showed a clear preference for children. Children were more adaptable than grown-ups, learned languages more easily, and in the fullness of time could even identify with their captors. Indeed, one of the most striking features of this form of bondage is that Indian slaves could eventually become part of the dominant society. Unlike those caught up in African slavery, which was a legally defined institution passed down from one generation to the next, Indian slaves could become menials or servants, and with some luck attain some independence and a higher status even in the course of one's lifespan. Another fascinating feature of the traffic of natives has to do with the involvement of the Indians themselves. As noted earlier, prior to European contact, Native Americans practiced various forms of captivity and enslavement. With the arrival of Europeans, they naturally began offering captives to the newcomers. At first, Indians occupied a subordinate position in the emerging regional networks of enslavement, serving as guides, informants, intermediaries, guards, and sometimes junior partners, generally dependent on the Europeans' markets and slaving networks. Europeans had the upper hand because of their superior war technology, specifically horses and firearms, which allowed them to prey on Indian societies almost at will. What started as a European-controlled enterprise, however, gradually passed into the hands of Native Americans. As Indians acquired horses and weapons of their own, they became independent providers. By the 18th and 19th centuries, powerful By the 18th and 19th centuries, powerful horse riders, equestrian, why can I say that word? Societies had taken control of much of the traffic. In the Southwest, the Comanches and Utes became regional suppliers of slaves to other Indians, as well as to the Spaniards, Mexicans, and Americans. The Apaches, who had early on been among the greatest victims of enslavement, transformed themselves into successful slavers. In colonial times, Apaches had been hunted down and marched in chains to the silver mines in Chihuahua. But as Spanish authority crumbled in the 1810s and the mining economy fell apart during the Mexican era, the Apaches turned the tables on their erstwhile masters. They raided Mexican communities, took captives, and sold them in the United States. So persistent and widespread was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown prohibited native bondage under all circumstances in 1542, but the traffic continued. More than a century later, in the waning decades of the 17th century, the Spanish monarchs launched an empire-wide campaign to free all Indian slaves. But this precocious crusade also fell short of what increasingly appeared to be an unattainable goal. In the early 19th century, Mexico proscribed all forms of bondage and extended citizenship to the Indians. Yet Indian slavery persisted. One of the most revealing aspects of this other slavery is that since it had no legal basis, it was never formally abolished like African slavery. After the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment prohibiting both slavery and involuntary servitude. Although the inclusion of the latter term opened the possibility of the liberation of all Indians held in bondage, in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court opted for a narrow interpretation of the 13th and 14th Amendments that focused on African Americans and generally excluded Indians. It would require the involvement of Congress, President Andrew Johnson, and some of the most dedicated abolitionists and colorful figures of the post-Civil War era to bring some relief to a people who had long been subjected to one of the worst forms of bondage. Even so, the other slavery continued through the end of the 19th century and in some remote areas well into the 20th century. Disguised as debt peonage, which stretched the limits to accepted labor institutions and even posed as legal work, this other slavery was the direct forerunner of the forms of bondage practiced today. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the other slavery had been a defining aspect of North American societies. And yet it has been almost completely erased from our historical memory. At last count, there were more than 15,000 books on African slavery, whereas only a couple of dozen specialized monographs were devoted to Indian slavery. To be sure, scholars of Latin America have broached the topic of labor coercion in considerable detail, but such work is often subdivided under various rubrics such as encomiendas, grants of Indians given to meritorious Spanish overlords, and repartimientos, compulsory labor drafts to which Indians were subjected, which are generally generally distinguished from outright enslavement. The end result is a failure to grasp the common threads running through all these institutions and gain a better appreciation of their combined scope. The consequences are plainly visible today. Whenever the conversation turns to slavery, people typically imagine black slaves. Hardly ever does anyone think of Indians. It is as if each group fits into a neat historical package. Africans were enslaved, and Indians either died off or were dispossessed and confined to reservations. Such an oversimplification is troublesome, because Indian slavery actually explains a great deal about the shared history of Mexico and the United States and casts new lights on even familiar events. If we want to find answers to such varied questions as why the Pueblo Indians launched a massive rebellion in 1680 and drove the Spaniards out of New Mexico, why the Comanches and Utes became so dominant in large areas of the West, why the Apache chief Geronimo hated Mexicans so much, why Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo prohibited Americans from purchasing Mexican captives held by the savage tribes, why California, Utah, and New Mexico legalized Indian slavery, disguising it as servitude or debt peonage, or why so many Navajos appear in New Mexico's baptismal records in the aftermath of Colonel Kit Carson's Navajo campaign of 1863 to 1864. We have to come to terms with the reality of this other slavery. Anyone who reads about the history of northern Mexico or the American Southwest will invariably run into indigenous rebellions prompted by exploitation, raids on Indian communities, and labor coercion. And yet it remains hard to see the forest for the trees. Lacking a sense of the overarching system of enslavement, it is impossible to put such scattered and localized practices in their proper places, just as it would be extremely difficult to make sense of the kidnappings or intertribal warfare of West Africa without reference to the transatlantic slave trade. With the other slavery, I hope to provide a broad but detailed portrait of the system of native enslavement that loomed over North America for 4 centuries and is a key missing piece of this continental history. Before embarking on this exploration, I feel compelled to issue 2 caveats. First, this book does not offer a running history of Indian slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Such a gargantuan task, the equivalent of writing the history of African slavery in the New World, could not be accomplished in 20 or even 50 volumes. Instead, I focus on some areas that experienced intense slavery. Thus, the story begins in the Caribbean, continues through central and northern Mexico, and ends in the American Southwest, with occasional glimpses of the larger context. And even within this restricted geography, I limit myself to examining moments when the evidence is particularly abundant or when the traffic of Indians underwent significant change. The second caveat concerns the definition of Indian slavery. Who exactly counts as an Indian slave? The honest answer is that no simple definition is possible. Although some scholars of African slavery have attempted to specify the declining qualities of the peculiar institution. Such an exercise is very difficult to complete when confronted with the extremely variable labor practices to which Native Americans were subjected. Initially, Indian slavery was legal, and therefore the victims of this traffic were clearly labeled as slaves in the documentation. But after the Spanish crown prohibited the enslavement of Indians, owners resorted to a variety of labor arrangements, terms, and subterfuges, such as encomiendas, repartimientos, convict leasing, and debt peonage to get around the law. Although these forms of labor are impossible to fit into a simple definition, they generally shared four traits that made them akin to enslavement: forcible removement of the victims from one place to another, inability to leave the workplace, violence or threat of violence to compel them to work, and nominal or no pay. Like a deadly virus, Indian slavery mutated into these strains and became extraordinarily resistant through the centuries. In this book, therefore, I use the phrase "the other slavery" in the double sense that it targeted Native Americans rather than Africans, and that it involved a range of forms of captivity and coercion. Some scholars may object to this broad usage, which glosses over conventional labor distinctions, but my reasons are threefold. First, since masters and officials devised these newfangled terms and practices to retain control of Native Americans when formal enslavement was no longer possible, it makes sense to lump them together in recognition of their ultimate purpose, which was to forcibly extract labor from natives. Kaleidoscopic labor categories have long prevented us from assessing the labor system as a whole and making fundamental distinctions between voluntary and coerced work. Second, these labor practices may have seemed quite distinct to officials and masters at the time and continue to seem so to researchers today, but they were decidedly less so to the victims themselves, who experienced the everyday reality of labor coercion with little or no compensation, whether on account of debt, because they had allegedly committed a crime, or for some other circumstance. The third reason is that a similar multiplicity of coercive arrangements is still prevalent today in what is often called the new slavery. There is no single institution or business model in the contemporary trafficking of humans. Instead, there are several related practices adapted to different regions of the world and types of trade, such as sex trafficking or child labor. And even though these modern forms of bondage cannot be neatly defined or reduced to fit into a single all-encompassing definition, they are no less real. It was no different with the other slavery. Whew. Lord help me. So anyway, that's the introduction. My apologies for stumbling over these words. I should have had a couple of peppermint tea over here or something like that. But I hope at least that you caught some pieces in there that you found interesting. This book, I'm telling you, just this book, y'all. Please jump on board and read this book with me this month. Since we are starting it in the middle of October, we are going to have the Zoom discussion in the middle of November. But to kind of get back on track, I may introduce a third book for November, like at the beginning of November, and just make it be like a shorter book. I'm still trying to figure out. I wasn't really sure how I want to go about this, and I'm still not very sure how I want to go about this whole book club. I thought initially that it should be, there's a lot of heavy books in here. So the 1619 project is heavy. This book is heavy. Other books that I would like to introduce are heavy. I haven't read them yet, but I just from flipping through them and deciding to include them, I know they're heavy. So I'm like, do people want to do heavy all the time, or should we sort of balance it out? I'm good with that too. Fiction, sci-fi, everything doesn't have to be nonfiction, you know, or talking about something related to history or related to tragedy. Sometimes we need to just balance that out, you know what I mean? Universal law is balance. So I'm trying to figure that out. Hopefully, maybe some of y'all can give me your input on what do you think, how it should go. But in the interim, we will be reading this book. And also, I have been on Clubhouse almost since the beginning of it, I think. It's been like almost a couple of years now, and I do not use it. So I'm thinking to start where the actual deeper discussion will be November 12th, 8 o'clock, Zoom. You have to register. Y'all have to let me know if you're gonna come through, because otherwise I would just be sitting there waiting, and nobody's gonna show. So contact me on Facebook at Beyond Clouds, or you can even go into the website beyond-clouds.org and message me there, or shoot me a text 223-488-9439. But do some sort of a way, let me know if you're going to come or not. So that'll be with the more, you know, I guess fuller discussion of the book. But on Clubhouse, I'm thinking weekly we're going to, I think I'm going to have like discussions on there, maybe per chapter. Let's see how many chapters are in here. Yeah, there are only 12 chapters. So that'll be, let's see. 4 weeks for the book. So yeah, it would have to be like every week we discuss 3 chapters. They're not very long. If you're like a fast reader, that should be good. And you don't have to have finished all the chapters either. But that's what I'm thinking I'm going to do. So we could just touch on some things, like little ideas, because by November 12th, and after reading the whole book, unless you are an avid note taker, I am. That's why I can't get through books if I just sit there and read it. But unless you are an avid note taker, you're probably not going to remember a lot of things that you may have wanted to talk about. So that's why I think it would be cool to meet up via audio room weekly. And then also there are a lot of things, like for instance, I find it very, very heartbreaking but interesting how with the African enslavement, I'll just use that term for now, but African enslavement, how men were, you know, prime, but in Native American enslavement, women were prime, and they cost so much more than males would. So I found that to be really interesting. I also found some other things interesting, which are like in the next chapter, which I'm not going to bring up, but you know, those things would be really cool to just sort of discuss for maybe a half hour or so. If you tell me if you think that's a good idea to meet up on Clubhouse weekly, and what day, what time do you think would be good? Because you know, people work during the week. So although I know a whole lot of entrepreneurs, but real people, real adults, I'm not included in that, have, you know, 9 to 5. So let me know what you think. Although the cool thing about Clubhouse too is it's on the phone. So you can be driving and have your AirPod in, and you know, we kind of chatting, or if you don't want to chat, you can just be there. You don't have to talk, or you don't have to, you know, participate, but we want you to participate. So that's that. I'm also going to, I might as well say this now, although it doesn't pertain to the book club per se. I'm also on Clubhouse going to start meeting twice a week for journals. So if you are on my it's supposed to be Facebook and Instagram, but I've been really bad about uploading to Instagram for like anything. But On Facebook, if you are on my Facebook, the Beyond Clouds Facebook page, then I am pretty good with posting journal prompts, 3 a week. So I'm thinking to kind of hook up on Clubhouse and just discuss things that, you know, the prompts, you know, promoted. Is that something else is going on? Oh, we're also going to be starting watch parties. So there are a lot of cool movies. I am a documentary freak. So is my son. He got it honest. I'm sorry. If any of his friends or anything were annoyed when you wanted to watch a movie, he wanted to watch a documentary, that's my fault. Put it on me. But I love documentaries, and I like movies too, you know. But yeah, those. And I'm also thinking about doing watch parties for us grown-ups, so we, you know, can handle the cuss words and all that kind of thing that are on these shows. But I'm thinking also to have like a family watch party, maybe once a month. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Tell me what you think. The next family day bowling will be coming up. I'm thinking next month, but I'm kind of I don't know yet, because, you know, the holidays, people who celebrate secular holidays, it's about to kick off. So I don't really know how that's gonna go. I will let you know on that, which day will be good. Maybe earlier in November. I have something nice coming up for I have something nice coming up next month. Also, please hit me up, because I have started making appointments to go within the schools to speak with the kids about Native American history and things of that nature. I have some really, really cool like artifacts and such. I'm telling you, it's gonna be so dope. But if you are an educator, if you are a homeschooler, if you're in a homeschool group, please contact me. Again, my phone number direct is 223-488-9439. That is the Beyond Clouds number. Or you can contact me again through Facebook, Beyond Clouds, or at the website beyond-clouds.org. I think that's it. I hope that's it. I will apologize once again for not being that great of a reader. Now when I have to read 10.5 pages without stopping, I need some tea or something. But anyway, everyone, thank you so much if you lasted to the end. And again, do tell me what you think about the ideas that I have about Clubhouse and da-da-da-da. All right, peace, good night. The sun is gone, which means I need to get on the road. Talk to y'all later.